This is the GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 189 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with food system instructor and author Tanya Dankla-Cobb about organic gardening techniques. The plant profile is on Japanese Andromeda, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events and this week's garden tasks in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on the wildflower garden. This episode, we're joined by Tanya Dankla-Cobb. She's written the Backyard Homestead Guide to Growing Organic Food, and we're going to talk all about organic gardening. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy.
Great to have you. And before we get into all about organics, let's talk a little bit about Tanya. And I want to rewind it all the way back to baby Tanya and ask if you were born with a green thumb and chlorophyll in your veins.
No, hardly not. No, not at all. In fact, I did all kinds of things wrong, and that is what motivated me in the very beginning to go down this path. Is I think my first. My mother loved to have little tiny patches of flowers in the backyard. But I remember I was a teen when I thought I would try to grow some carrots and some tomatoes. And I had no clue. And my mother, as an educator, thought I needed to learn by experience. So when she saw that I was putting my seeds behind a hedge, meaning in the shade,
Hmm.
she thought that would be a great lesson. And so I was so excited when the carrot tops grew to, I don't know, almost 2 feet because they're reaching for the sun. But there was almost no carrot. And I learned all kinds of things. And then I did live in DC for 12 years. And I successfully killed many things. And most dear were the peach trees that I lived in the Palisades and had these wonderful peach trees and that I had planted because I was so excited and I successfully killed them. So I was going to be in charge of this large organic farm, and who was I to do that? I mean, I'd been working for the feds and international labor rights. What that has nothing to do with planting or gardens or anything, right? And so I was terrified and thought I need to start doing some big time research. And the more I started researching, the more frustrated I got with oh my gosh, what is going on? There's like one place that talks about harvesting, another that talks about pests, and another thing that talks about how to plant and but there's no one place that has it all for like everything I want to know about, from putting the seed in the ground for tomatoes to harvesting to putting them up, or preventing diseases, what allies or companions do well. And so I started I didn't know it at the time because this was before what we now know as databases, but this is in the late 80s when I'm starting to do this research to
Hmm.
actually, calm my terror of what I was supposed to be doing. And it was quite remarkable on my journey of trying to learn about organics and sustainable. I visited a U-Pick organic farm outside of DC near Harper's Ferry and went to visit them with a girlfriend who was helping me. And I asked if I would be able to pick their brains. And they said, well, yes, you can, but you need to do some weeding in order to get our time. So we came with our gloves and we weeded the entire morning. And, and it was about, midday, and we sort of like tentatively, very, like, oh, is it possible maybe that we could get a minute of your time? And they started laughing and said, you know how many times we've asked people to do this, and you're the first that have ever brought gloves and weeded. You're the first. They said, you can have as much time as you want. And so, we chatted for probably an hour or so, and I ended up telling them just on the side that I was putting all this information together, and they said, "Oh, would you bring it by?" And um, I'm like very reluctant to do it because it was in the days of dot matrix printing and all of that. And so they finally convinced me, and I did. I brought it in a box. I said, "Okay, here you go." And about a week later, they called and said, "Come on back out, and we'll give this back to you." And but basically, their message was, "You need to publish this." And I was like,
Hmm.
"What? Are you kidding?" And I don't know anything. I'm a know nothing. And I'm just trying to get the information together. And they said, "Oh no, you would have saved us years of agony and mistakes." And I'm like, "What?" So that sort of started my second career, second, I call it my second life, if you will, when I met with some family and everything, and my husband at the time and friends, and just ended up, because I had such a clear vision for what I needed. I thought, well, if I need this, and I was so anal about it, then other people must need it too, if what they're saying is true. So
Hmm.
we should be true to the vision. And if we, so the idea was, well, let's try self-publishing. So before self-publishing was cool, and I followed the there was a great book out. I followed the recipe, if you will, and successfully self-published. And after very successfully, and after a couple of years, decided I don't want to publish. I love to write. I want to garden. I want to write. And but publishing isn't for me. And that's when story took it over. And so what we have today, which is so exciting, is the fourth. So in a way, it's kind of like a classic now, right?
Mm.
It's the fourth iteration of that book that first came out in 91. And it's completely updated. We've gone through and updated everything that we thought needed to be updated and more, and sections have been rewritten. And so this is fresh, off the bench, so to speak. And it's just, I've learned so much through the years. So, no, it was not in my blood. This book is a result of it not being in my blood.
Excellent. Well, I would say that's quite a journey of 20 plus years of the book, and prior to that, your garden babyhood on up. And
Yeah.
was that the original title when you self-published?
No, this book has had four different titles. So now today, the book is The Backyard Homestead Guide to Growing Organic Food, a crop by crop reference for 62 vegetables, fruits, nuts, and herbs. Yeah, I'm very proud of it.
And what was your first title that you named it?
Um, it was called Gardening at a Glance,
Hmm.
the organic gardener's home reference for vegetables, fruits, nuts, and herbs.
Well, it's still a mouthful.
It
But
is it is all of the titles are way too long.
yeah, but definitely descriptive. And I think that even that first title, I would know exactly what I was reading. So that's super helpful.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about where you are gardening at home today, and maybe for those listeners outside the Mid-Atlantic area, talk about your soil, your zone, your ecoregion, maybe if you know it.
Yeah, sure. So I moved out of DC, and after a couple of moves, I landed in Central Virginia in the Central Piedmont, outside of Charlottesville. So I'm in a shifting zone. It's in the seven-ish zone. And I'm on a hill in a very rural part of what's called Fluvanna County. And the hill on the plat says it's called Slate Hill. And so you can imagine I live on a hill of slate. So there's very little soil actually, and it's full of slate rock. And so my garden beds, in terms of clearing some of these areas for beds, they're bordered with, these rock edges that have been created were created by son and friend of his, at base wages, collecting all these rocks. But most of the beds really to create them, I've needed to. My husband was a custom home builder, and so he would bring soil that needed to be removed from other places where he was building. And instead of taking it someplace else, it was like, okay, we need some soil here. And there's a place nearby that offers what we call, it's called Panorama Gold, and soil and compost available. And so through 30 years now, here is my beds are, you know, have been every year I add compost or other amendments, and they are beautiful beds, with where if you dig into the beds, you can dig deep. If you try to dig anywhere outside of them, I literally walk around with a pickaxe. So, in order for me to take daffodils and sort of naturalize them in the trees or wherever I want to put them, I have to use a pickaxe because it's slate. So it's kind of a bizarre place to be gardening, but
Mhm.
we have made it work. And Central Virginia, Piedmont region is very humid.
Mhm.
So that's one of the things that's really sort of governs a lot of choices here. I'll say that, but otherwise, it's a beautiful region to be in.
Mhm. Yes, such gorgeous, and you know, Thomas Jefferson's around the corner.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
totally,
Monticello.
totally. Yeah, it's called, we now call it the presidential precinct, meaning
Mhm.
that there's Madison, Monroe, and Jefferson all within, half an hour.
Mhm. And their predecessors who established those plantations and farms there did so for a reason. There, it's just a wonderful area.
Absolutely. And it is a tremendous agricultural region. It's not as much Virginia's breadbasket as the Shenandoah Valley is,
Mhm.
but we have a lot of agriculture in our region that ranges. Now we actually are even growing hops. It's crazy.
Mhm.
But you have a lot of cattle, and we have pastured pork and chicken and beef, and we have all kinds of organic gardens. When I first moved here 30 years ago, there were none. I might have been the first in the county. I think I was. And now there are, I want to say, 5 or 6 organic farms, not just gardens, but farms that are
Mhm.
selling and doing quite well. So it's really remarkable what's happened with organics and the rise of awareness of their importance, and how, especially during the COVID era, it's really interesting how more people became aware, and more people were interested in buying local and buying healthy.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so important. And I think more and more studies are coming out about organic gardening and how it's healthy for not just you, what you consume from your garden, but also the process of growing. So if you're buying organically grown food, the farmer, the workers weren't exposed to chemicals bringing that food to you.
Oh my gosh, you're not kidding. But and Kathy, the ripple effects are monumental, because when we think about Virginia, for example, being in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and we think about those who are familiar with the Chesapeake Bay, it's one of the largest, most beautiful estuarine regions in our country, if not the world. And it has what's called a pollution diet that has been applied by the federal government because it's been so, it, it, it was on the verge of dying way back in the 90s. And so, one of the things that was found to be one of the largest contributors, a large contributor, in addition to wastewater facilities, in addition to urban areas, is agriculture. And so, you can imagine, if you are using high nitrogen, high phosphorus, and and herbicides and other things on large tracts of land that are feeding a river, then you're affecting the aquatic life. And then downstream, you're affecting the life of the Chesapeake Bay, which is actually feeding millions and millions of people with crabs, which we all love, crab cakes, right? And scallops and all kinds of fish. And it's not only people, as you said, the families impacted through because of their application, but then you have to think about you're also affecting the health of the soil. And one of the biggest things in organic gardening is the mantra of feed the soil, not the plants. And
Mhm.
so if one of the things that happens with in organic gardening is that are focused on making sure that the soil, which is an incredibly complex ecosystem, a living, thriving ecosystem of microorganisms and macroorganisms, the macro being things like earthworms and beetles, and and the micro being mycorrhizal fungi, and it's just a teeming with life. And that is what produces our food. Everything we eat, everything we eat somehow, some way originates, if you will, is impacted by the health of that soil. So even if you're eating meats, I mean, the only thing that might not be would be the fish, but then you say, well, that's affected because of the runoff,
Mhm.
right? So really, you think about the web of life is everything is connected to the soil and the health of the soil. That argument could be made at least. And um, so so yeah, the focus is on how do we feed the soil and not harm it? How do we do no harm to that soil? How do we make sure that it continues as a living, thriving ecosystem that is balanced and grows fabulous food, or feeds the chickens or the cows or the pigs, or whatever it is, or the trees that drop the acorns for the pigs to eat. So it's all connected.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to define organic gardening, but I think you just summed that up perfectly. Since so many of us have a different understanding of the word organic.
Yeah, organic is a word that actually it relates to living organisms. So, in chemistry, for example, we think about organic chemistry as the study of carbon compounds, usually of living beings. I don't know that it has anything to do with non-living beings. And so, but organic has always related to living organisms. And it's important to also talk about what it means in today's world versus like decades ago, because in 2002, the National Organic Program was promulgated by the federal government, which set up technical standards for being able to call something organic. And it requires certification, and it requires a number of things. And so it requires agents who go and inspect the farm and make sure it meets the federal standards for organic. But what I want to say to those, folks who are listening is that when you go to a farmer's market, for example, you may come upon a farm stand that doesn't have the label organic, and you might ask the farmer, how do you grow these beautiful vegetables? What are you putting on your fields? How do you control pests? And that farmer may actually be growing organically, but they're really not allowed to say that. And so that's important to understand, is that once those standards got established, is the word, in some people's view, was co-opted.
Mhm.
And so that led to what we now see at the farmers market, is this array of terms, and each term is nuanced and means a little bit something different. So, and somebody who's growing organically might call themselves no spray, or might say regenerative, and that has a specific meaning where you're actually, like growing the soil, which is possible. And or they might say sustainable. They might say IPM, integrated pest management. But so that's part of, I want people to be able to cut through what may be confusing and understand that organic means that you are paying attention to the soil. There's many terms that may be under that umbrella of organic, and probably the best thing to do is to talk to the farmer and find out what they do.
Mhm.
And anybody who is growing sustainably or organically will not hesitate to tell you.
Mm.
I have found that because I've tested it myself. And those who are reluctant to talk about it are usually using some kind of pesticides or herbicides that might not qualify as organic or sustainable.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's today's world is much more complicated than decades ago.
I agree. I would say at my local farmers markets, I've seen creative wording and signs for anything from we're a natural farm to
Right.
sustainable agriculture. Some do have the organic certification, and some will just say we don't spray chemicals or something like that in a statement.
Right,
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah, and each one has its different meaning. Yeah.
Exactly, and talking to them is a big help, especially in getting to learn. And I would say for most of us that would satisfy you, as you said. So in your book, you talk about creating a self-sustaining garden. Can you define what the self-sustaining garden looks like?
A self-sustaining garden is really, I think, an aspiration. And it's a challenge for all of us, in that it's something that I think we can aspire to, and it helps us make choices. So a self-sustaining garden, as opposed to a sustainable garden, is that it is supplying all of its own essential nutrients, right? And so, meaning that instead of my bringing in compost, a local place that I trust that creates beautiful compost, I may choose to grow my own compost. And will decide that I'm not going to import things like soil amendments, that I'm going to work with plants and other things that I can use to balance out what needs to be balanced out in my garden. So I think it's an I just want to say again, I think it's an aspiration, because when I started down this path, I really thought it was attainable. But I think to be truly self-sustaining, I think you can approach it, and we need to have that as our sort of ultimate goal, if you will, because it will challenge us to not just go and throw stuff on the garden. Will challenge us to think through, what does this garden really need that maybe I'm doing to cause this imbalance? And what do I need to do differently? I'll give you an example. So I did a soil test with a fellow in Virginia who's fabulous, who you can get free soil tests with Virginia Cooperative Extension. or it might cost $10 today. I think somebody told me it might cost that now. But there are people who can go much deeper than the kind of feedback that you'll get from the standard soil test. And this fellow is a soil scientist that is part of the Virginia Association of Biological Farming, and he'll do a much more detailed analysis. And he came back from with my soil test and said, "I bet you've been putting compost on every year for a bunch of years." And I was like, "Yeah," I thought,
Uh-huh.
like, "Yeah, is it what's wrong with that?" And he said you need to balance it out with either this green manure or some straw, or leaf mulch, and it was like, okay, so even though compost is like the go-to for so much in organic gardening, you can also overdo it. So and you need to balance it. And so that's part of what a self-sustaining garden really strives to achieve.
Hmm. I love that example. And I would say, there's really no such thing as self-sustaining. Like you're saying, it's an aspiration because everybody has help somewhere along the line, and you're obviously going to swap for seeds or at some
Yes.
point need new inputs or new refreshment, like you said, with the grass clippings or green manure. Because if you're always pulling from the same system, it gets kind of congested. I'll use that word, and needs new inputs every once in a while. And my favorite example of that is garlic. Like you
Yeah.
can save your garlic head and plant it maybe 2 or 3 years in a row, but after that, the yield starts to go down.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the vigor, it's the seed vigor as it is goes down. I was so fascinated. I was visiting different farmers across the country, and this one woman I absolutely love, Rosemarie Williams, a Navajo farmer and rancher in northwestern Arizona, was showing me her incredible records and seed keeping. And we were talking about that, and she was saving all of her seeds. And, I was saying, well, how long have you been doing this? And how, because they were as self sustaining as maybe anybody could get with what they were doing there. And I said, how do you retain the vigor? Oh, well, she said, we have there are other farmers within, I can't remember, I think it's within something like 50 to 75 miles that we do periodic exchanges with, because we know that we'll lose the seed vigor. So yes, even these native techniques, right? That they know, and we know that you it is an aspiration. You have got to renew. You at some point are going to rely on others, and you are going to need help. Yeah.
Hmm. And, is 1 year your crops are going to fail, or, your little row of carrots, and you might want to trade some radishes for somebody else's carrots.
Exactly. Exactly. That's what they did. That's what they do. Yeah.
Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about some of the organic remedies you talk about in your book. And the first would be selected beneficial insects. And I guess the key on that phrase is the selected.
Well, it's because it's not complete, right?
Hmm.
I mean, to do a complete list of beneficial insects, I'm not sure how long it would have to be, but I think it would have to be very long, I would think.
Hmm.
Yeah, so there are selected beneficial insects, and we can think about things like, I mean, everybody knows about the bees, right? And so the bees are pollinators. And so, what do we want to grow to attract the pollinators that are going to make sure that whether it's squash or the beans or whatever else that we actually get a fair amount of what we're looking for. So beneficial insects, and we also think about plants, right, as beneficials. That beneficial plants can attract the beneficial um, insects that can do good things, like parasitic wasps and flies. Like if you plant fennel and carrots, parasitic wasps love those kinds of things. Um, and dill and coriander and dandelion, they can attract good insects that help control the insects that will damage your crop. Um, and then there's things like beneficial nematodes, which I can't say I've ever seen one. I think they're really microscopic, um, but they will kill back. They basically will attack an insect with bacteria that then kills the host, right? So they don't harm humans, they don't harm the bees or other beneficials. And so there is a thing like beneficial nematodes that people that can be used, and that are a safe control for a number of pests.
Good examples. And so you say your first line of defense in organic gardening remedies is to plan ahead.
Oh, yeah. I love to tell stories on myself because I've made just about every mistake that can be made. And I continue to experiment every year. But to I love to share, and because I laugh about it so much. Here I am, I'm already, what I think is, at least I've got some experience as a gardener.
Hmm.
And I'm with my husband. We're, building a new house. We've moved, on Slate Hill. And I am, watching the way the sun goes, and the air circulation and everything else. And so I'm so excited, I'm so eager, and impatient. Really, that's a key word. I was impatient to get going. And so I put a very first set of 3 beds in. And when did I do it? I put them in late fall after the leaves have dropped. So what do you think happened? I had failed to really look up and think about the big trees
Mm.
that were going to be creating a shade garden instead of a lovely place for vegetables and herbs. And so, yeah, planning is pretty darn important. And my message is be patient. And ideally, the ideal is really to spend a year somewhere and do careful observation of what is happening where on in the landscape, and where am I going to get the proper amount of sun for the vegetables and herbs. And ideally, if you're in a region like mid-Atlantic, which is very humid, if I have to choose, I'm really going to choose early morning sun because I want that dew to burn off as early as possible. And so I'm going to prefer that sun exposure over being in the shade for the first few hours and then having sun into late, late evening. In summer, we're still light until 9 o'clock. So, but I'm going to prefer the early morning of 5, 6 a.m., getting some sun to 8 or 9 in the evening. So planning ahead, your location is huge, your soil condition. Do you need, what do you need? Do a soil test. Find out, what is alive in your soil. Do you need to encourage earthworms? Do you need peat humus? And I think always starting, I would say you probably are going to need some compost.
Hmm.
And you want ideally to avoid an area that's been soil compacted. Compaction, we've learned, some studies at Virginia Tech have shown that soil compaction really, so if bulldozers, for example, have been running over a particular part of the landscape, and compacting it at a deeper level than you can be aware of, you are likely impacting the yields that will be possible. You still will be able to grow, but your yields will be different. That's one of the things that we've been finding. Um, and and think about, ideally, do you want to have raised beds, and are they built and constructed raised beds, or do you want to have more sort of rounded raised beds? That's more that what I have. So that, because if you have really lousy soil, which it's not that I have lousy soil, I have virtually no soil. So I had to do raised beds, right? Um, and you can think about things like, if you know that something has been grown there that you are worried about, that might have been diseased in any way, you might want to go about trying to solarize your soil. And there's ways to do that with some pretty, with thick plastic, and yeah. So there's different ways of doing that, but these are the kinds of things. It's not all of the things, but it's kind of the things that you need to be thinking about in planning.
Hmm.
And then the other piece of planning is how many, because rotation of your crops is really important when you're growing food, as part of sort of the interruption of a disease cycle. That's the one of the big purposes for rotating. I've got 4 beds, and then I've also got sort of a bed around the perimeter, inside perimeter of my garden, and I rotate every year. I move what's planted in a particular bed. I move it over one to the next bed, and so that if something was attacking the tomatoes this year, a different crop will be in that bed next year. So thinking about how many beds do you want to have, how do you want to organize it so that you're able to rotate easily, and things like that.
Hmm. I think those are great points. And I love your example of the morning sun and being able to have that dew kind of burnt off or by the sun as it rises, because so many of our plant tags, especially for our perennial gardens, say this plant prefers morning sun, afternoon shade, and that's because of the afternoon sun being so strong on the leaves that it would burn some of those perennials and shrubs. But when we're talking about food gardening, you want to give it as much sun as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to prevent the fungal and bacterial and viral diseases that are spread by water. You want to dry that water as much as possible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I would say, how can we make our landscapes all morning sun? How does that work? And if you're facing on the wrong side of the hill, that's going to be a problem, obviously.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I thought was such a gas is the farmers that I visited outside of Harper's Ferry with the UPEC farm. I remember them telling me, because they were a little bit in a dip. Their farm was not up higher on the hill, and that dew stayed on the crops for a long time. And so one of the things we know to prevent disease spread is, wearing gloves, and but they said they would take hair dryers out to dry the crops as early as possible before touching them
Whoa.
with any hands or gloves, because if it's wet and you touch it and then you go and touch something else,
Mm,
you are potentially spreading a disease.
those fungal
They
spores. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, that explains sometimes when I've seen large fans out in the field, like those huge fans, those 10-foot by 12-foot greenhouse
absolutely.
fans. And I've always thought, why are you drying things out in the sun? That didn't make any sense to me. Now it makes more sense.
Yeah, because maybe they need to prune, maybe they need to pick, maybe they need to do something else.
Hmm.
And they can't touch those trees until they're dry.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, in organic gardening, obviously, one of the main problems that you're contending with are diseases that you're not going to be able to spray for. So what are some other prevention techniques you can use?
Yeah, so I think prevention, it goes back to so much is in the soil and the prevention. So that is why we focus on healthy soil, because healthy soil is going to give the plants a better immune system. So it's like just like our bodies, if we are eating well and resting, then we're sort of giving our bodies the best chance of having the strongest immune system possible. There are things that are going to happen for sure. But if we eat horribly and don't sleep and do the things that are necessary for the health of our system, then we know any kind of immune attacks that we have are not going to go, it's not going to be pretty.
Hmm.
So it's just like that is we're trying to build the immune defenses of the plants with the soil. But I think another big thing is really understanding. I think this is a really big message is that any single garden typically only has 3 to 5 pests. That's it. That's the average. And I know when I learned that, I was stunned. I was like, "Oh my god," it's like a medical school student has 100 diseases in a year
Hmm.
because they're reading about it, they're thinking about it, and they think they have it. They don't, but they think they have it. And so in the garden, if we read about all these diseases and pests, we're going, "Oh my gosh, we're doomed," but the truth is you're likely to have only between 3 to 5. And the other thing that's huge is to understand that plants can sustain up to 20% foliage loss without significantly impacting the yield. Now, in a flower garden, you might feel really differently, right? Like I can't deal with that. But in a food garden, rather than rushing to, finding the right spray or figuring out, you can relax a little bit and say, it's okay if I lose some leaves here. I need to take action and I want to take action, but I don't need to panic. That's a big message, I think.
I
It
think,
was
yeah,
yeah.
that's so true, especially the panic when you first see the damage and then they run off to, the pesticide section of the local garden center or hardware store and just freak out. So just wait and see is a good option, I would say there. And earlier you talked about having a healthy plant can withstand more disease and I would say non-stress plants also in studies have shown that they're more resistant to insects, but those that are stressed, by drought or damage or something else, they're almost sending out these chemical signals for insects to attack them because
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tell the story of in the incredible drought of the early 2000s here. I remember there were so many gardeners saying their entire bed of tomatoes died. Was not watering. I was not watering, and my entire bed of tomatoes was thriving. And then we had a summer where we were had the deluge, the deluge of just rain and rain and rain, and people were like, I've lost everything to this, botrytis or another fungal like another disease. And it's like, okay, well, I had some damage, but I had a great crop. And I'm not saying it was me, I'm saying it's the soil. It's the soil and the attention to those kinds of things, as you just said, that help the plants thrive in the face of adversity.
hmm, and I can say anecdotally at my community garden, the plants plots that were abandoned like mid-season because the people couldn't stand the heat anymore or anything like else like that, those tomatoes are not getting watered, they're not getting pruned or, harvested, and they have a bigger yield a lot of the times than the ones where somebody is taking care of the plot, habitually watering and doing everything for them, which kind of irked me at first, but then I realized, you know what? Plants want to live. they want to produce. And even if half the foliage falls off the tomato plant because of a fungal disease, once the fruit is set, it's set.
Yeah, I love what you just said. And one of the things you said reminds me of something that another, native farmer told me that just made my mouth drop open is seeds want to grow. And as you said, plants want to grow. That's in their DNA. And, we're stewards. We're not making it happen. We're just trying to be helpful. And so, uh, less is sometimes more in this situation in organic gardening. In terms of remedies, I'll say that there's three levels in organic. There's mechanical remedies, there's botanical remedies, and there's biological, when you're actually bringing in like beneficial nematodes or other beneficial insects, and usually that's at a larger farm scale when they need large things like that and they're doing integrated pest management. So most home gardeners are either going to be doing mechanical remedies or botanical remedies, like a neem would be, which comes from the neem tree and is an insecticide. That would be considered a botanical spray and an organic remedy. But the fun part, this is what I hope your listeners will get into and groove on, is the mechanical remedies are where the fun is.
Hmm.
And so for me, for example, Japanese beetles are a big thing here and they love my blackberries. And so for me, the best remedy for that is early morning when they're still immobilized and they're on the plants, and you can take different things. You can take newspaper, you can take a plastic tarp, you can take whatever, a sheet, an old sheet, and put it down under the blackberries, and all you have to do is use a broom handle and knock them off, and then have a bucket nearby with some, they used to say have some kerosene in it, but and oil, but really just oil suffices, a layer of oil on top, and you dump them in and they get smothered. And the same thing for other types of insects, is a dust buster, handheld dust buster vacuum is fabulous. Go in the early morning when they're not very active and not flying around a lot, suck those babies up and dump them into the bucket, and boom. The other thing is, my third favorite thing, which is a little bit of zen in the garden, is putting on some gloves and, for the squash bugs, which is something that I do get, one of the 3 to 5 that I get, and basically turning over leaf by leaf, the leaves of the
Mm-hmm.
squash plant, and just squishing those eggs.
Mm. Yeah.
Squishing those eggs. And it's prevention. But there's tons of fun and weird mechanical remedies, if you will, that we have compiled in this book through many, many, many years. And we do differentiate between those that have been tested and those that are sort of passed down and anecdotal. But the anecdotal ones are often the ones that I end up using and find most useful. So I would tell people to not panic, to take your time to identify exactly what it is, and have some fun with the least harm remedies possible, right? Which are the mechanical remedies.
Mm-hmm. So, how can our listeners contact you to find out more?
I would love to connect with listeners on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn with my name, Tanya Dankla Cobb. You can also contact me through Instagram and Twitter. I've got a handle, Reclaiming Our Food, and Story Publishing. You can contact me through Story Publishing. So I would welcome hearing from anyone.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I think this has been so enlightening, and I love those little tips and tricks you shared with us today. And I think all of us who embrace organic gardening and chemical free gardening love your message and will get a lot out of your book. And I wanted to ask if you would share some final thoughts about organic gardening.
I think a final thought is that there is a feeling among people that organic is somehow hard and it takes more effort. And my message is that if anything, it's easier and it's less costly. The costs go into different things. So instead of buying NPK, fertilizer, you're buying compost. Or you're simply gathering up your leaves and making a pile of your own leaf mulch, right? That you'll then spread on parts of the garden. So I would say it's easier and less headache and less worry. It does provide incredible satisfaction. And that's what I also want to share. Incredible satisfaction because my neighbor's kids can come into my garden and they can pick a leaf off of the basil and they can I brought them in. I said, "Here, pick this. Taste this herb." And there's no fear. There's no fear. It's all good. So that's my message.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanya.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Pyrrhus japonica, plant profile. Japanese Andromeda, Pyrrhus japonica, is a landscape shrub that has clusters of delicate white or pink blossoms that drip from the branches in early spring and are visited by a number of pollinators, such as the native mason bee. It is also known as the lily of the valley shrub. It has thick, glossy leaves that start off in shades of red, then turn a deep green as they mature. This evergreen is deer resistant and attractive in all seasons. It is native to Asia and is a member of the Ericaceae family, which includes rhododendrons. It is hardy to USDA zones 5 to 8. This shrub thrives in part shade and prefers moist, well-drained soils. Give it protection from winter winds. Spread pine needle mulch around the base of the plant and feed it with a fertilizer for acid-loving shrubs, such as that formulated for camellias and azaleas. Pruning is generally not necessary, but if you must do so, cut it back after it finishes flowering. It can be propagated by stem cuttings. Depending on the variety, it can reach 8 feet wide and high. There are also dwarf cultivars available. Newer varieties have variegated foliage, and the smaller versions can be grown as container plants. Pyrrhus japonica, you can grow that.
What's new in the garden this week? Well, my early tulips are blooming, and over at the community garden, the borage has wintered over and is starting to bloom as well. The garden tasks we shared on our social media channels this week included tips on hardening off seedlings, so check those out at our Twitter or X account at WDC Gardener, on our Washington Gardener Magazine Facebook page, or at our Washington Gardener Google group, which is open and free to everyone. Some local gardening events you might want to participate in include the Growing Natives Plants from Seeds on Saturday, May 16th. This is a lecture and demonstration with a giveaway of cold-treated seeds by the Hyattsville Horticultural Society in downtown Hyattsville, Maryland. You can find out details about that at hyattsvillehorticulture.org. And on Saturday, April 27th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., Montpelier Festival of Herbs, Teas, and the Arts is happening, and that is in Prince George's County, Maryland, and that's part of Prince George's County Parks. There will be vendors there selling plants and herbs, crafts and fine arts, food vendors, kids' activities, and more. At the Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, they will be holding their spring Arboretum walking tours, and all tours meet at the ANC Welcome Center information desk, and you can find out details about that at arlingtoncemetery.mil, and all tours are open to the public. The upcoming ones include on Friday, April 19th, the Arboretum Spring Plant Tour in celebration of Earth Day. On Friday, April 26th, the walking tour that emphasizes Arbor Day, and then the garden tour of the ANC on Friday, May 3rd. The White House gardens should also be open to the public in April, but they have not yet announced those dates. I would check weekly at whitehouse.gov's website if you're interested on seeing the White House garden and grounds in person. Happy gardening!
In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. Whether you're growing edible plants or beautiful flowers, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the Urban Garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org. Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with the new book Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional, everyday grass lawn. In the last 3 years alone, over 23 million American adults converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now are looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn is knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Author Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the details on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Available at bookstores now and also at Quarto.com, where you can get 30% off using discount code GARDENING30.
For this episode's last word, I thought I'd read an excerpt from the Washington Star's Garden Book 50th Anniversary Edition that was published in 1994, and this is on the wildflower garden. The growing of wildflowers in the home garden is a natural desire, usually beginning during childhood. The desire persists with many gardeners all through their gardening days. Some of the interest in wildflowers undoubtedly stems from their earliness. Others think of them because of their natural habitat in the woods. Perhaps we might add a third point of interest. They are native to this area. Also, most of them are comparatively free from insect and disease problems. The metropolitan area's list of native flowers and ferns is very extensive. More than 50 kinds of ferns, for example, are to be found in this vicinity. Several kinds of violets, as well as the trilliums, gentians, and other wildflowers may be seen in our parks, at the Nature Trail at Great Falls, and in the Fern Valley section of the National Arboretum. The latter includes, of course, many wildflowers from areas distant from Washington. And that was the last word on the wildflower garden from the Washington Star Garden Book 1994 edition. Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com. Thank you. Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.blogspot.com. Thank you. You can find and follow Washington Gardener on Twitter/X, Instagram, and Pinterest at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. Please take a moment to rate and review this podcast on Spotify and Apple. Open the Spotify or Apple app, search for GardenDC, check on the rate button and select 5 stars.